climate change, nuclear threats, and runaway technology. Today's crises know no borders. This is episode 8 of 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. Navigating the now a conversation about why nationalism alone can't solve global problems and why the future demands international thinking. Welcome to the deep dive. We're taking a stack of sources, digging out those crucial insights so you can get informed fast. Today, we're really plunging into some fascinating ideas from Yuval Noah Harari's book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, specifically looking at the chapter on nationalism.
Yeah, and our mission for this deep dive is to really explore a core question Harari raises in this material. Can turning back to nationalism actually tackle the huge global problems we're facing right now?
Right, these 21st century challenges.
Exactly. Or is it more of a distraction, maybe even, a dangerous one that could lead us into real trouble? We'll look at where nationalism came from, its history, and see how it kind of stacks up against today's unique issues.
Okay, let's start with something that feels pretty fundamental. This idea that nationalism is, just natural. Is it this deep-seated, eternal part of being human? It often feels that way, doesn't it?
It absolutely feels that way. But the source material offers a really interesting counterpoint. It argues that while, yes, we are definitely social animals, hardwired for loyalty to small groups, maybe, a few dozen people, like a tribe, loyalty to millions of strangers, that's not natural. Harari says it's actually quite a recent thing, really only widespread in the last few thousand years, which in evolutionary terms is like yesterday.
That's kind of surprising. So if it's not natural, why did it pop up? What drove it?
Well, it seems it developed because human society started facing problems that were just too big for those small tribes to handle alone.
A bigger scale needed.
Exactly. The source uses this great example of ancient tribes along a Nile River. To survive, they had to control the river, right? Manage floods, build irrigation canals. But no single tribe could possibly build the huge dams or the complex canal systems needed.
Makes sense.
So over time, these tribes, they sort of gradually merged. They formed a larger kingdom. And that larger unit, that kingdom, did have the scale, the manpower, the organization to manage the river, build granaries, set up trade routes, all the things needed for survival that were just, impossible for a small group.
So a practical solution for bigger challenges led to bigger groups.
Yeah.
But wow, building that feeling of belonging, that loyalty to millions of people you've never even met, that sounds like a massive job.
Oh, it is. The source actually calls this loyalty to millions a miracle of recent history. It definitely doesn't just happen automatically. It needs, and I think the source puts it really well, a mammoth apparatus of education, propaganda, and flag waving.
Wow.
Plus, you need those national systems, security, healthcare, welfare, that bind people together. This loyalty, it's constructed, it's cultivated. It's not something we're just born with for massive groups.
That's a really important distinction.
Right.
And the source also talks about different types of nationalism, right? It's not all painted with the same negative brush.
Exactly right. Harari draws a really crucial line between what he calls benign patriotism and dangerous ultranationalism. Benign patriotism is like believing your nation is unique, it deserves your loyalty, and you have special duties to your fellow citizens.
Okay.
And the source argues this can actually be a really positive force. It pushes our empathy, our cooperation, way beyond just our immediate family or local tribe. Think about countries like, say, Sweden or Germany or Switzerland. Strong national identities, sure, but also generally peaceful, prosperous places with solid social support.
Right.
The argument is, without that kind of national bond, maybe you'd see more fragmentation, more chaos, like in places where strong national cohesion is lacking, citing examples like Afghanistan or Somalia.
So patriotism can be a step up from just pure tribalism.
Yeah.
It expands who we care about.
It can be, yes.
So where does it tip over into being dangerous?
It tips into ultranationalism or chauvinism when you go from thinking, my nation is unique, to my nation is supreme. When you feel you owe all your loyalty just to the nation and you have basically no significant obligations to anyone outside it, that's the kind of nationalism that historically has fueled, horrific wars.
But for a long time, even with the wars, nationalism seemed to offer a pretty good deal for the average person, didn't it?
It really did, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries. I mean, despite the unbelievable cost of wars like, Passchendaele or Verdun, the modern nation-state was simultaneously building these amazing systems: national health care, universal education, welfare programs.
Things people hadn't had before on that scale.
Exactly. It offered a level of security, prosperity, predictability that just wasn't possible before. So for many people, the benefits seemed worth the terrible risks.
And then 1945.
Yeah.
The game changes completely. This is where it gets really critical, right?
Absolutely fundamental shift. The invention of nuclear weapons just completely rewrote the rules. The fear wasn't just losing a war anymore. It was total annihilation.
Yeah.
And as the source puts it pretty bluntly, total annihilation has a way of sharpening people's minds. That absolute terror of nuclear war, it was powerful. Powerful enough to force countries to cooperate in new ways to kind of push that aggressive nationalist genie back into the bottle, at least somewhat.
It's like that Nile example again, but instead of the river, it's the bomb.
That's a great way to put it. Just like those ancient tribes needed a bigger entity to handle the river, now, in the nuclear age, nations started building maybe a kind of basic global community above the nation state. Why? Because only global cooperation seemed to offer any chance of controlling this nuclear demon.
That makes me think of that really stark 1964 Daisy ad from the U.S. election. The little girl, the countdown.
Yes, the source brings that up, and LBJ's incredibly powerful line from it. These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
Chilling.
And it's amazing, isn't it, that sentiment, make love, not war, which we often think of as counterculture, was being stated as cold, hard reality by mainstream politicians like Johnson back in '64 because of the bomb.
So the Cold War, paradoxically, kind of put a lid on extreme nationalism because of this overarching nuclear fear. It forced a more global perspective.
In many ways, yes. And then after the Cold War ended, for a while there, globalization seemed unstoppable. The feeling was that nationalism was sort of fading away, maybe just lingering in less developed places.
But that's clearly not what happened.
No. The last decade or so has seen this huge resurgence of nationalist feeling, and not just in Russia or India or China, but right in the heart of Europe and the U.S. too.
Why now? What does the source suggest is driving this return?
Well, it points to a few things. A feeling of alienation from, big, impersonal global capitalism, a fear that those national safety nets, healthcare, education, welfare, are being threatened by these global forces.
So people feel vulnerable.
Exactly. And in that anxiety, the nation feels like, well, a refuge. It offers a sense of security, community, maybe meaning when faced with these huge, abstract global problems. It's like retreating to something familiar.
Which brings us right back to that LBJ question. Are we choosing to live together, or are we heading into the dark? Is this current nationalism maybe escapism, a way to avoid facing problems that feel too big?
That's precisely the argument the source makes, that nationalism ultimately just isn't equipped to deal with the three biggest existential threats we face today. Threats that don't care about borders and demand cooperation on a scale the nation-state alone just can't deliver.
Okay, let's break down those three threats. The first one we've touched on, the nuclear challenge.
Right. In 1964, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, that threat felt incredibly real, immediate. But the source makes a crucial point. Humanity did respond. The major powers, the US, the Soviets, China, Europe, they actually managed to rewrite thousands of years of geopolitical rules.
How so?
They avoided nuclear war, and they significantly reduced other kinds of wars, too. This led to, arguably, the most peaceful period in human history since 1945. Harari calls this maybe the greatest political and moral achievement of our time.
An achievement we've maybe dangerously forgotten about.
That's the worry. Complacency has set in. The source warns, there's a new arms race happening now, developing novel doomsday machines. The public, it's like we've learned to stop worrying about the bomb, maybe just ignore it.
The source used the Brexit debate as an example of forgetting history, didn't it?
It did. How the conversation was all about economics, immigration, but very little about the EU's role in keeping the peace on a continent that spent centuries tearing itself apart with nationalist wars. Building that international system, the one that prevented nuclear Armageddon and fostered peace, was incredibly hard work. And sure, it needs updating, maybe less U.S. dominance, maybe a bigger role for China, India, but just chucking it all away to go back to old-school nationalist power struggles? The source calls that incredibly irresponsible.
Because the basic reality changed in 45.
Exactly. Before Hiroshima, nations could play the nationalist game, go to war, even win or lose, without destroying everything. That's just not possible anymore. Nuclear weapons change the fundamental nature of war, of politics. Survival now really depends, on putting the prevention of nuclear war ahead of any single nation's interests.
So when nationalists shout, "Our country first," Harari's question is, can your country alone protect the world, or even itself, from nuclear destruction without global cooperation? And the answer is pretty clearly no. No nation can do that by itself.
Okay, that's the nuclear threat. What's the second major global challenge the source identifies? The ecological challenge. Basically, the risk of ecological collapse, driven primarily by climate change. This wasn't really on the radar as a top-tier threat back in 1964, but today, it's absolutely existential. Humans are destabilizing the entire planet's biosphere.
Are we doing that specifically?
Well, we're taking out resources like never before, and we're pumping back enormous amounts of waste, pollution, changing the soil, the water, the air itself. The source gives this really vivid example. Phosphorus fertilizer from farms in, say, Iowa, washes into rivers, flows down to the Gulf of Mexico, creates these huge dead zones where the oxygen is gone and fish just die. It shows how local actions ripple out globally.
Leading to habitats degrading, species going extinct?
Yes. The source uses pretty strong language, suggesting humanity is going from being an ecological serial killer to an ecological mass murderer. And this potentially undermines the very foundation our civilization is built on. The most urgent part of this right now is climate change.
And unlike nuclear war, which is a potential future, climate change is happening right now. We see it.
Absolutely. Our actions, mostly burning fossil fuels, are changing the climate faster than anything humans have ever experienced. Think about it all. Of human civilization, agriculture, cities, everything. It all grew up during the Holocene, the last 10,000 years or so of incredibly stable climate.
Right.
So deliberately pushing the climate out of that stability. It's a massive, uncontrolled experiment with billions of lives at stake.
And the science is clear on the urgency.
Extremely clear. The source emphasizes that we need drastic cuts in emissions, like in the next 20 years, to have a decent shot at avoiding truly catastrophic impacts. We're talking vast new deserts, oceans rising to swamp coastal cities, way more extreme weather, huge refugee crises.
And tipping points too, right? Like ice melting.
Exactly. Melting ice caps mean less sunlight reflected back to space, which means more warming, which means more melting. It's a dangerous feedback loop.
And yet, Harari noted that back in 2018, emissions were still going up.
Still increasing. The scale is just immense. It's like humanity needs to check into fossil fuel rehab today. Harari even uses that analogy. Hello, I am Homo sapiens, and I am a fossil fuel addict.
So how does nationalism measure up against this crisis? Can any single nation fix climate change?
The source is emphatic. Absolutely not. There is no purely nationalist solution to the ecological challenge. Doesn't matter how powerful you are, you can't build a wall against climate change. Countries aren't ecologically sovereign.
What do you mean by that?
Well, think of Kiribati, a low-lying island nation. They could go totally carbon neutral tomorrow, but they'll still drown if the big emitters don't change. Or Chad, they could put solar panels everywhere, but still turn into a desert if global weather patterns shift because of what others are doing. Even the US or China need Russia and others to act if they want to protect their own coasts.
And maybe nationalist isolationism is even more tricky here than with nukes, because the impacts hit different places differently.
That's a really key point the source makes. Nuclear war is, well, bad for pretty much everyone, but global warming. Russia might actually see benefits: warmer Siberia, open Arctic shipping routes. Meanwhile, Bangladesh or the Maldives face utter disaster. That difference makes finding common ground based on national interest much, much harder.
Plus the economic divisions, right? Oil exporters versus importers.
Totally. Countries like China or Japan that import tons of fossil fuels have an economic reason to push for renewables. But countries whose economies rely on selling oil and gas, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, they have a strong national incentive to resist that shift.
So if you're a nationalist leader, you might be tempted to just focus on your country's short-term gain, or kick the can down the road.
Or just deny the problem exists. Exactly. The source notes that climate skepticism often aligns with the nationalist right, even mentioning the Chinese hoax idea. Since there isn't an easy national fix that makes climate change go away, some politicians seem to prefer denying the problem itself.
The source did mention some potential tech fixes, though, like clean energy breakthroughs or lab-grown meat.
It does. Harari discusses clean meat, growing meat from cells. The potential is huge: less animal suffering, more food security, and a massive reduction in farming's climate footprint. He points out the cost plummeting from like $330,000 for the first lab burger to potentially being cheaper than farmed meat soon.
Wow.
These kinds of innovations offer hope, definitely, But the source stresses they need global coordination, global implementation to actually tackle a global problem effectively. One country inventing clean meat won't solve it alone.
Okay, so that's two huge global threats, nuclear and ecological. What's the third one Harari highlights?
The third is technological disruption, specifically the convergence of information technology and biotechnology. The source warns this could lead to things like digital dictatorships becoming incredibly powerful, or maybe creating a vast global useless class as AI and automation take over more and more jobs.
And can nationalism handle this wave of change?
Again, the source argues, no, the nation state just isn't the right framework. R&D and AI, biotech, genetics, it's global. It doesn't respect borders. If one country charges ahead with something really risky, like, say, genetically engineering humans for certain traits.
Others feel they have to keep up.
Exactly. It creates a kind of global race to the bottom, especially if the world is already divided by suspicion and national rivalry. Nobody wants to be left behind technologically, even if they have deep ethical concerns. Preventing that kind of destabilizing race seems to require some level of global trust, maybe even a shared global identity.
And these aren't just economic or military changes. This tech could change what it means to be human.
That's the really profound point. We're talking about upgrading bodies and minds, maybe even creating entirely new kinds of life. Now, most people can agree we want to avoid nuclear war, we want to avoid ecological disaster, but the ethics of genetically enhancing humans or creating artificial consciousness, there's massive disagreement across cultures and nations.
Yeah.
If we can't establish some shared global ethical guidelines, the source warns it becomes open season for Dr. Frankenstein. The consequences could be, well, unimaginable.
And nationalism, focused on borders and distinct identities, just isn't equipped for those kinds of species-level ethical questions.
Harari calls it a failure of the imagination. Nationalist thinking is stuck in, centuries-old fights over land and who belongs where. But these tech revolutions, they're on a cosmic scale. We could be moving from 4 billion years of life shaped by natural selection to a future of inorganic life shaped by intelligent design. Humans, as we know them, might not even be around.
Replaced by something else.
Maybe super intelligent but non-conscious AI, or beings totally different from the human form. What does, say, French nationalism or Russian nationalism have to say about that possibility?
Not much, I imagine.
Exactly. To make wise choices about the actual future of life itself, Harari argues, we need a perspective that's global, maybe even cosmic, something far beyond narrow nationalism.
So these three huge challenges, nukes, climate, tech challenges, they're not separate silos. They actually feed into each other, making the whole situation even more complex and dangerous.
That's maybe the most crucial takeaway. They are deeply interconnected, reinforcing each other, creating this unprecedented, multi-layered existential crisis. Think about it, an ecological crisis, like massive food shortages from climate change, that could easily push nations towards desperate, high-risk technological gambles. Like during the World Wars, how desperation drove rapid tech development, but maybe even faster and more recklessly. Would ethical rules about AI or genetic engineering hold up if millions are starving? The source seems doubtful, and tech disruption itself makes war, including nuclear war, more likely. Cyber attacks could cripple nuclear command systems. Putting advanced AI in charge of nuclear strategy, remember the AlphaZero chess example, handing those decisions to non-conscious algorithms is, frankly, terrifying.
And if nations see each other primarily as rivals,
They have very little incentive to cooperate on any of it. They won't easily agree on AI limits if they're competing. They won't easily agree on drastic climate action if they distrust each other. Trying to tackle all three of these interconnected crises at the same time, while divided into competing nations focused on their own interests, it's an incredibly tall order. Failure on one front makes solving the others much harder.
okay, so let's try to pull this deep dive together. If the source argues that the current nationalist trend can't fix these fundamental problems, what's the alternative? What's the way forward presented here?
Well, the core argument is crystal clear. Nationalism can't solve these issues because technology has changed the world. We face global threats that demand global answers. Harari suggests, maybe provocatively, that a common enemy is the best way to forge a common identity. And humanity now has three clear common enemies: nuclear war, ecological collapse, and runaway technological disruption.
Facing us all.
Exactly. And if, in the face of those enemies, we keep putting our narrow national loyalties first, the result could be much, much worse than 1914 or 1939.
So what's the better path?
The better path, according to the source, is to consciously complement our local and national loyalties, which are real and important with significant obligations to a global community. Harari uses the European Union as an example. Imperfect, sure, but look, distinct nations, proud of their histories, who still decided after centuries of bloodshed to build something together, based on shared interests and responsibilities.
And that doesn't mean giving up your national identity.
Not at all. The source is very clear on this. It's not about abolishing identities or making everyone the same. In fact, you could argue the EU framework has allowed local patriotisms, Flemish, Catalan, Scottish, to flourish more peacefully. Think about it. William Wallace needed an army. Modern Scottish independence was debated via referendum. That's a huge difference, arguably enabled by the larger, stable EU context.
So it's possible to be loyal to your family, your town, your job, your country, and also loyal to humanity and the planet.
That's the proposal. Why not add humankind and planet Earth to that list? Yes, loyalties will clash sometimes. Family versus job, nation versus globe. But, as the source puts it, who said life was simple, deal with it.
The core problem seems to be this mismatch. Global problems, national politics.
Precisely. Harari argues nations today are like those ancient Nile tribes, just not the right scale for the biggest challenges. We have a global ecology, global economy, global science. But our politics, our primary loyalties, are stuck at the national level. That mismatch paralyzes us.
And the solution isn't necessarily a world government, which sounds pretty unrealistic anyway.
Right. The source explicitly calls a single world government a doubtful and unrealistic vision. The key is to globalize politics, which means political discussions and decisions within countries, cities, communities need to start giving much more serious weight to global problems and the shared interests of humanity and the planet.
Thinking globally while acting locally and nationally.
Exactly. Embedding that global perspective into our existing political structures. Relying purely on nationalist feelings won't get us there. The source even briefly asks if universal religions, which used to think globally, could help foster this perspective today, or if they're also part of a bygone era facing these modern challenges.
This deep dive really underscores how these huge, tangled crises of the 21st century, nuclear, ecological, technological, are fundamentally global. They just demand a level of international thinking and cooperation that, according to Harari's analysis here, traditional nationalism can't really provide on its own.
Yeah, and it clarifies that globalizing politics isn't about erasing nations or setting up some global superstate. It's about making sure our national and local choices consciously consider and prioritize our shared future as a species on this planet.
So as you reflect on these powerful ideas from the source material, here's a final thought to maybe wrestle with. In your own life, how do you actually balance that loyalty you feel to your community, your nation, with the obligation you might feel towards all of humankind and towards the planet itself? Is it truly possible and maybe even necessary to hold on to your national identity while actively cultivating that broader sense of global responsibility, especially when facing challenges this big?